Good afternoon, everyone. We'll start with the statement from the Secretary-General previewing the meeting of defense ministers here, and then we'll take your questions.
Good afternoon. Tomorrow, NATO defense ministers will meet as we begin to prepare for the NATO summit in The Hague in June. And later today, the UK will host ministers here for the next meeting of the Ukraine Defense Contact Group. I welcome the UK's willingness to share this responsibility and look forward to joining ministers this afternoon. I also look forward to welcoming Pete Hegseth, the new US Secretary of State of Defense, who is joining us for the first time. We already had a great first discussion by phone after he was sworn in, and we do agree there's a lot of important work ahead of us. So let me turn to that work and what we'll be focused on tomorrow. One topic at the top of our agenda is defense spending. We have robust plans in place to keep our 1 billion people safe in a more dangerous world. But we don't have all we need to implement them fully if required. Work is now underway to agree ambitious new defense capability goals for allies, the so-called capability targets, that will be key to ensuring we have the right people and equipment in place to deter and defend. And this requires that many allies, especially in Europe and Canada, invest considerably more. We know what needs to be done. And we are moving in the right direction, step by step. European allies have been stepping up. Today, I am pleased to share our latest figures. Since the 2014 Defence Investment Pledge, European allies and Canada have added more than 700 billion additional US dollars for defense. In 2024, NATO allies in Europe and Canada invested 485 billion US dollars in defense, a nearly 20% increase compared with 2023. With a full two-thirds of allies spending at least 2% of their GDP on defense. I expect even more allies to meet and, in many cases, exceed the target in 2025. So we are seeing substantial progress. But we need to do a lot more so we have what needs to deter and defend. And so there is a more equitable burden sharing in place. We also need to produce more, together. And tomorrow, defense ministers will discuss how to strengthen our transatlantic defense industrial capacity, including through an updated defense production action plan. In the past few years, we have seen a substantial increase in defense production across the alliance. But we need to go further and faster. There's no time to waste. I also expect ministers to agree on a number of other important initiatives, including our new commercial space strategy and on further strengthening NATO's integrated air and missile defense. We also discuss Ukraine. Tomorrow afternoon, we will meet in the NATO-Ukraine Council with Defense Minister Rustem Umerov and the EU High Representative Kaja Kallas. Since 2022, NATO allies have provided Ukraine with unprecedented support, including 99% of all military aid. And we have seen recent additions to this from, let's say, Sweden, Finland, Canada, but also, of course, from France, the Mirages and the F-16s from the Netherlands. Other allies are also stepping up their efforts to train more Ukrainian troops. NATO's newly established command in Wiesbaden to support Ukraine is at the forefront of coordinating these and future contributions. At the Washington summit, allies pledged to provide Ukraine with 40 billion euros of security assistance in 2024. Allies have not only met their commitments, they far exceeded them. They have provided over 50 billion euros, more than half of which comes from European allies and Canada. This sends a clear signal of our unwavering commitment to Ukraine. It also takes a big step in the direction of what President Trump has called for. I agree with him that we must equalize security assistance to Ukraine. But to really change the trajectory of the conflict, we need to do even more. The stronger Ukraine is on the battlefield, the stronger they will be at the negotiating table, the greater the chances of getting a good deal for lasting peace. And that is what we all want for Ukraine, for our shared security, and for our global stability. Finally, we will address Russia's ongoing campaign for our global stability. Finally, we will address Russia's ongoing campaign of destabilizing actions against NATO allies. We see acts of sabotage, assassination, dangerous jamming of civilian airlines, and attacks on critical infrastructure, including undersea infrastructure. And NATO is responding, including through Baltic Sentry in the Baltic Sea and with increased vigilance across the board. With that, I'm ready to take your questions.
All right, we'll start with CNN.
Good afternoon.
Oh, microphone. Class Bastian from CNN. How do you interpret the comments that we heard from President Trump on Monday that Ukraine may someday be Russian? Do you take it seriously? And even if you don't, how worried are you that this makes Western commitment to Ukraine appear fragile in Moscow's eyes and could undermine future security guarantees?
We are intensely coordinating with President Trump's team at all levels, and these are very good conversations. This week we have many senior American officials visiting Europe, here at NATO, but also, of course, in Munich at the security conference. There is a convergence of views that we have to make sure, one, that Ukraine gets in the best possible position to start talks. Two, to make sure that whatever comes out of those talks, and when that will happen, that we have to be sure collectively and assure collectively that what comes out of it is durable. So no repeat of what we had with the Minsk agreement in 2014.
All right, Reuters.
Secretary-General Andrew Gray from Reuters, you said that the assistance needs to be equalised, assistance to Ukraine between the United States and other allies, but you've just given figures that show the majority of that aid comes from other allies, not from the United States. So how much of a rebalancing does there actually need to be? And secondly, on the same theme, you said in Davos that if the Trump administration is willing to continue supplying American weapons, Europe will pick up the bill. How many European leaders have agreed to do that, and have they told you where the money will come from?
Well, first of all, we are on the right trajectory, indeed, when it comes to the aim of equalizing what the US basically decides as a one nation within NATO comparable to all the other allies within NATO, so that we are equalizing. And here we see that Canada and Europe are even over 50% now, so that is good. But we have to maintain that trajectory. That's crucial, and I completely concur with President Trump and his team that this is the only sensible way forward. Then, of course, to the question of future support for Ukraine, no doubt there will be a debate, I expect, between allies, who is going to pay for it, where it comes from, etc. But there is also a large agreement between all allies that we have to make sure that Ukraine has what it needs in terms of training, in terms of military equipment, to make sure that whenever peace talks start, they can do that from a position of strength.
All right, Sky News.
Thank you. I'm Deborah Haynes from Sky News. Thank you. I'm Deborah Haynes from Sky News. Donald Trump has repeatedly called on European NATO allies to spend more on defence, and he's also made clear that his priorities for security are facing up to the threat posed by China. Made clear that his priorities for security are facing up to the threat posed by China and defending America's own borders. How confident are you, therefore, that America would come to Europe's aid if European NATO allies came under attack? And could European allies alone defend themselves?
I think my reaction needs to have two elements. First of all, on the defense spending. President Trump has consistently asked for the Europeans to do more. We had a pledge in Wales in 2014, and basically not a lot happened after 2014. And it really started to take off when he was president in post-2016, 2017, and particularly in 2018, 2019, up to today, including the 20% increase, 23 compared to 24. US, NATO allies, so excluding the US, Canada and the EU, paying 20% more. And we have to continue this. The good thing is that what we have in place now is a process based on NATO's defense planning process. What we have in place now is a process based on NATO's defense planning process, which will lead to clarity on what needs to be done to keep us safe, the capability targets. From there, we will see where the gaps are. And we know already that they probably will be in the area of missile defense, air missile defense, in the area of logistics, military mobility, long-range weapons, but also to increase the strength of our armies. Yes, the Navy and of course our Air Force, but particularly when it comes to our armies, we'll have to do more, including making sure that they can fight prolonged wars, and that they will be more heavily armed, including with tanks. And all this costs money. We are now getting those numbers on the table, and this is the big difference with 2014. There it was, let's do 2%. Now we will have a content-driven debate. How do we fill the gap between where we are and where we have to be? And I expect this to be north of 3%, I said before, but I'm not committing to a number now because we are still at the early stage in exactly coming to the details. And then on Europe and the rest of the world, I think when we discuss this with our American colleagues within NATO, there is a clear joint assessment that what happens in Ukraine or what happens in Europe, and particularly now in Ukraine, is not only Russia-Ukraine or Russia-Europe. It also involves North Korea, China, Iran. So there is an interconnection now between what happens in the North Atlantic and in the Euro-Atlantic area on the one hand, but also in the Pacific on the other hand. And that means that all these theaters are getting intertwined. And that means from a strategic point of view, we have to make sure that we assess them like this. But I completely understand that the Americans want the Europeans and the Canadians to pay more. And again, back to the first question, we are assessing exactly what needs to be done based on the capability target process.
All right, Ukraine public broadcasting.
Thank you. One of the possible points of US peace plan is to postpone Ukraine's accessions for NATO for several years or even decades. What's your position on that? And short of NATO membership, how can NATO allies provide Ukraine security guarantees after possible ceasefire? Thank you.
We have one problem here, and that is that we have a democracy, and that means that journalists ask questions to the politicians coming in, to me as Secretary General, and that is great. The big difference, of course, with Moscow is that Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin is not facing this. So he can keep his ideas close to himself. And I do not want him to be wiser than he is already. He is sitting there in that reclining chair, awaiting what I'm going to say here and others will say at NATO. I know two things. One, we have to make sure that Ukraine is in the best possible position whenever talks will start about the future of this conflict. And when we have brought it to a conclusion, that the outcome of that discussion, the peace deal or whatever it will be, has to be durable, enduring, has to be concrete, carved in stone, that he will never ever again try to attack 1 square kilometer or 1 square mile of Ukraine. These two things are for me crucial. And then we can easily brainstorm about the best way forward, including NATO, other countries getting involved, exactly how to do that. But again, it makes him wiser than he should be. This is all part, of course, of future talks within the alliance, and then to a certain extent, probably also with him. But let's not make him wiser than he is already.
DPA, up in the back here.
Thank you. Ansgar Hase, German press agency, DPA. Secretary General, according to new calculations, Russia spent more on the military and armament last year than all European allies combined. Do you consider these calculations credible? And if so, how do you assess these findings? Thank you.
Well, I mean, we can always go through the numbers and then probably hint at one or two points where they are not correct or overcorrect or whatever. But let's look at the bigger picture here. And the bigger picture is that Russia at this moment is spending 40% of its state budget on defense, is spending almost 10% of its national income on defense. And of course you have to have the purchasing power figured in those numbers. I understand that it has been done. So for me, it is also confirmation of the fact of what I tried to say in my speech in December, that yes, we are safe now. Our deterrence and defense is strong at this moment, but not in 4 or 5 years. If we do not take some difficult decisions this year about, yes, Ukraine, obviously, but also about defense spending, doing much, much more than the 2% we pledged in Wales, and those not yet on 2%, please get there before summer. But also on production. We have to make sure that we produce enough. And this is a problem not only for the European part of NATO, but also the US part of NATO. Because all of us, from California up to and including Ankara, we are not producing enough. We have to do more. More shifts, more production lines.
Interfax Ukraine.
Thank you, Secretary General.
Good afternoon.
Goedemiddag.
Goedemiddag.
Okay. Irina Somber, News Agency, Interfax, Ukraine. Question regarding today Ramstein Group. What is your expectation? What kind of outcome can be from this meeting? Will it die? Will it survive? And if it will survive, what kind of role can play NATO in this?
Well, clearly you need both, because what the Ramstein format, the UDCG, is doing is making sure that allies and other countries outside NATO commit to make sure that Ukraine has what it needs in terms of particularly support with concrete material to fight the war against Russia. And I already mentioned some of the big announcements the last couple of 2 weeks from Canada, Sweden, the Netherlands and France. And no doubt, I hope today, but also the coming days, you will see new announcements coming out. So you need that format. And then you need to set you to make sure that you organize all the aid being delivered into Ukraine in the best possible way, that it has maximum use for you guys in Ukraine to fight the war. Plus, of course, making sure that the training takes place. Because what you need is the defense gear to defend yourself, the tanks and the anti-ballistic missiles, the air defense systems and everything you need to defend yourselves and to fight the war, but also the training. And that is what NSETU is organizing. So we need those two. So I think there's a future for both.
All right. Echo Radio. Here in the front in the center.
Hello, my name is Artem Besedin. I am from ECHO. This is Russian media in exile. So my question is...
I was once on your station when you were still in Moscow in 2011.
Thank you so much. Danish intelligence reports that Russia is preparing to attack an EU country. And if so, why isn't NATO preparing for war instead of waiting to Russia to weaken in Ukraine? Some NATO members predict a Russian attack in 5 to 10 years. Does NATO share this view, and what timeline does it consider most realistic?
Well, let me not comment on every thing coming out of the intelligence community, which I take very seriously, and in this case what comes out of the Danish intelligence community. But it is, of course, we have to take note of this. But let me bring it back to what I said before, and that is that at the moment, if Putin would attack NATO, the reaction will be devastating. He will lose. So let him not try it. And he knows this. The deterrence and defense is very strong. What we have to make sure of is that 4 or 5 years from now, given his speed of ramping up his defense industry production and all the other stuff, but also look at what China is doing in having 1,000 nuclear warheads by 2030, investing heavily in its navy. the quality of everything they're producing now at a level that is really comparable to what you're doing within NATO territory. And that is why we need to do the three things. Ukraine, one, making sure that we spend more, considerably more, to make sure that we are able to defend ourselves also in 4 or 5 years. And we need to take those decisions this year. And three, making sure that we have what we need to defend ourselves, and that is the defense industrial base. And the problem there is we have fantastic companies all over Europe and Turkey and Norway and the UK and in the US and in Canada, but they're not producing enough. They are not producing enough. And my expectation is, in the 4 or 5 years, given all the money going around, the order books of Thalys and of Rheinmetall and Leonardo, but also Raytheon and Boeing and the big defense companies in Turkey and Norway, UK, they will be filled. And the big defense companies in Turkey and Norway, UK, they will be filled. But hopefully, they will also have put in place, and this is really crucial, the production lines and the shifts to make sure that we get the stuff sooner rather than later. Because otherwise, we have the money, but we can still not defend ourselves. So we need the two, plus we have to make sure Ukraine prevails.
Nos.
Thanks today, Dutch NOS Secretary-General. You started stating that you are in close contact, of course, with Trump's administration, meaning you are well informed. What then do you consider as a very unexpected, even bad news Pete Hegseth might come up with? And will you be surprised for these kind of prepared for these surprises?
Well,
prepared for these surprises.
Well, what the US is consistently doing, and this was Trump in his first term, it is again the present administration doing, is telling the European Canadian side of NATO, hey guys, you have to spend more. One, because we need it collectively to defend ourselves, and secondly, because if we spend more and we come closer to what the US is spending, or we come level with them, it means that where they are about half of NATO economy and the other 31 are the other half, that it is fair and it is common sense to do that. I mean, it's clear that we have to do this. And then, of course, on defense production, we have a collective problem, not just Europe and Canada, but including the US, because they're also not producing enough. And by the way, we spend 4 times more in the US than they spend in Europe. So financially, it's also a good deal for the US. But okay, that's not for me to comment on, but I would think, hey, this is also financially very helpful. So we need the Americans to also ramp up defense production on their side. And they will get a lot of money out of that, as France, Germany and Italy and Turkey, Norway and the UK will get a lot of money out of it, because we need all these defense companies to do this. And then on Ukraine, we need to make sure that they get in the best possible place whenever talks will start. And this is what we are discussing together, also assessing the fact that these so-called theaters, the Euro-Atlantic and the Indo-Pacific, are more and more intertwined, because we know that North Korea, China are part of this, and a bad deal on Ukraine will be watched by Xi Jinping and the other senior leaders in Beijing, and it might give them some ideas on some of their strategic goals they want to pursue in the region.
All right. TVR Moldova.
Thank you. Vadim Kiptanaru, Republic of Moldova, Secretary-General. In an extremely important election year for the Republic of Moldova, Russia is diversifying and perfecting its arsenal of hybrid war in our country. So how far could Putin go, and what can stop him? And by the way, half an hour ago, another Russian drone fell down on our territory again. Thank you.
Well, first of all, maybe we should stop calling it hybrid, because hybrid sounds cuddly, nice, lovely. It is not. It is really state-sponsored sabotage, and in some cases even state-sponsored terrorism. And at least it is destabilizing, trying to destabilize Moldova and the rest of Europe, Canada and the US. And as I said in my short introduction, this includes assassination attempts, jamming airplanes, what you're experiencing in Moldova, but also attacks on the National Health Service in the UK. And there are many examples. And this is why I'm so glad that as NATO, where we used to assess what was happening, we are now much more active in reacting to it together with our allies. Take Baltic Sentry. We brought together that whole activity thanks to General Cavoli under his responsibilities. We brought it together with allies in just 10 days. So the NATO system is able to do this fast. And we need to react to these type of so-called cyber attacks, these destabilizing activities much faster. And we will do that because we are not at war. We are not at peace either, as I said before, and this is one of the examples.
Kosovo TV.
Thank you. I'm Mehmet Krasniqi from Dugajini Television in Kosovo. Secretary General, can you comment on the recent elections in Kosovo and on the implication for the future relations between NATO and Kosovo? Thank you.
And of course, we follow what is happening in Kosovo keenly in Pristina, but of course this is a democratic process. My understanding is that there are initial results, but as far as I know, until today, not a final result. The Electoral Committee is will still report on the final results. And based on the initial results, it seems that there will be a coalition government. And of course, we will make sure that we will work with whoever is leading the country. And of course, we wish the Kosovar politicians well in navigating the political landscape and making sure that there is a stable government as soon as possible. Political landscape and making sure that there is a stable government as soon as possible.
All right. Radio Free Europe.
Thank you. Secretary General Olena Abramovich, Ukrainian Service of Radio Free Europe. If I may just quick follow-up on the question of my colleagues. So you mentioned in Davos that if US decides to continue support for Ukraine, Europe should cover the bill. Could you please specify, does it mean completely cover the bill or partly cover the bill, and how does it how do you going to ramp up the production inside and also spend much more money on American weapons for Ukraine? Thank you.
Yeah, I think there are a couple of issues in your question. One, of course, is to make sure that the stuff is there. The military support is there, and in many cases it comes out of our stockpiles. Sometimes you can order it from the defense industry, but obviously then it is not available and ready the next day. And we know that Ukraine itself has a really impressive defense industrial base. And we know that Lithuania and Denmark with other countries, Canada and others, Canada and others are involved. You have opened your defense industrial base for NATO allies to buy there and then procure from that and then to deliver it into Ukraine, which is also helping your economy. So that is the issue of how to get the stuff to Ukraine you need. And then and who will pay for this? It is my assumption that there will be more of a pressure on European allies to step up in terms of also the financial bill. That's my assumption.
BBC
Financial bill. That's my assumption.
BBC Russia.
Hi, my name is Elizaveta Fok from the BBC Russian service. Thank you for this opportunity. I wanted to ask you that given recent reports that communications between Moscow and Washington, specifically regarding the war in Ukraine, have significantly intensified, do you believe that NATO as an institution should maybe initiate a direct dialogue with Russia on the matter? What is the level of communication is right now? And additionally, with Russia on the matter, what is the level of communication is right now? And additionally, is there a risk, you think, that such close engagement between White House and Moscow, and we're seeing some mixed messages coming out of this conversation, can marginalize other NATO allies in discussions concerning Ukraine and European security? Thank you.
Yeah, well, when there are contacts between the US and Russia, NATO is more than 50% US. So in that sense, this alliance, the one ally is over 50% in terms of its economic power. of this alliance. So in that sense, I'm not worried if there are contacts, because we are all collectively involved within this alliance. But as I said before, I'm not going to speculate about whatever talks are ongoing and who should do what. We really have to keep the eye on the ball. And the eye on the ball means that we have to know the two goals we have. One is to make sure that we change the trajectory, what is happening in Ukraine, and make sure that they are in the best possible position whenever talks will start. But we also have to make sure that whenever they are concluded, that the outcome is there to stay. Will not be challenged by Putin half a year or 2 years later, like what happened with Crimea.
Rustavi 2.
I changed my work. I'm Euroscope now, but from Georgia. Of course, NATO is a military organization, but in the same time, political organization based on common values. In this case, how do you see, what's your estimation about recent developments in aspirant country, Georgia? I want to now stress on my colleagues Mzia Marlobeli's case. She's on a hunger strike, more than 1 month in a jail. And finally, also, how do you see future and recent cooperation between NATO and Georgia militarily? Thank you.
I have already commented before on the outcome of the Georgian elections, and also on our wish, of course, for Georgia to stay on a path towards NATO, towards the European Union, in line with our values of democracy and the rule of law and human rights. But I think I should refrain from doing that every time again. Because I did already, and obviously we are closely following what's happening in Georgia with some worry. You can be assured.
All right. Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung.
Thanks a lot. Thomas Gutschka, Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung. Secretary General, 2 questions, please. The first one, this morning, the new US Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth, said on X when he entered, or after he entered the building, that NATO needs to become stronger and more lethal. How do you read this more lethal part? What would it imply in practice? And the second question, you mentioned yourself that this threshold north of 3% that you've given in the European Parliament a few weeks ago. What would be a realistic time frame for reaching a new defense investment pledge? And what is the reactions, the feedback you have received from allies so far on this?
Well, first on lethal, he is totally right. NATO has to be a lethal organization, otherwise we cannot keep the deterrence going. And that's crucial. And as we discussed before, we have seen the rearmament of Russia. And the threat that is posing. Yeah? Your colleague was just asking that question from Echo News Agency. Unfortunately now in exile. So it is crucial that Russia's rearmament is met by us, and that our mindset has to be that we are willing to protect every inch of NATO territory, and we will. Not only now, and this is my plea, not only now, but also in the future. And this comes to your second question. That means that if we would stick to the 2%, we cannot defend ourselves in 4 or 5 years. We have to spend more, and not because I want some new target, but because when you look at what we are doing now, allies have asked us to do this. We do this together with allies, assessing the gaps we have between where we are and where we should be to defend ourselves in 4 or 5 years. They are simply too big, those gaps, to be filled by 2%. You will end up considerably north of 3, is my assumption at the moment. We'll see later exactly what that number should be, and of course including the timeline. I'm not going to speculate now about the timeline, but again, I would say rather sooner than later, and it has to be a credible timeline, so no repeat of what we did in 2014, committing to 2% and then nothing happened for the first couple of years. That's simply unacceptable, and not because only President Trump is asking us to do this, but because we have to defend ourselves. 1 billion people, to keep them safe. That's why we need to do that. And obviously, when I discuss this with political leaders, there's always the emotion and the ratio. So rationally, they see the argument. But at the same time, of course, when you're a politician, you have to make your choices in scarcity. And that means that you have to take decisions at the national level to make sure that the money is there, which is not always easy. But still, it needs to be done. And I think the large majority of political leaders understand that.
All right, we have time for one more question. Anadolu.
Turkish news agency Anadolu, Selen Valente. As you mentioned several times now, considering Turkey's defense capabilities that you witnessed during your visit to Ankara recently, what messages will you convey to the allied ministers about the role that Turkey can play for empowering the alliance's defense industry, in particular Europe's, as well as for achieving peace in Ukraine in the light of the fact that the new US administration is pushing for that? Thank you.
Can I say that the Turkish defense industrial base is really impressive. There are a couple of hundred organizations working on the innovation side. There are a couple of thousand companies involved, part of the secretariat, the Turkish Secretariat for the Defense Industry. I met in Ankara, but he also visited me here. The chief of that agency, directly reporting into the president, into President Erdogan's office. So that is really important. And I know there is a close cooperation between what you are doing in Turkey with other allies all over Europe and with the US. And you are really supplying some of the most important parts and sometimes end products in terms of what the Turkish industry is producing. And we can only ask you to do more. Whatever you can do in Turkey to ramp it up, to do more, to have even more shifts and more production lines. My prediction is in 4 or 5 years you will see them all filled to max capacity because the money is there. And the same goes for Naval and Thales in France and for Leonardo in Italy and for Rheinmetall in Germany and for all the BAE in the UK and all the other proud defense industry companies in Europe and Raytheon and Boeing and Lockheed Martin and all the other companies in the US. We really have to do that. So let's not discuss too much what we need to do in terms of stimulating that defense industry. No, tell them the money is there, produce, and make sure that we stay safe here. Thank you.
All right, thank you everyone. We'll see you tomorrow afternoon after the ministerial.
Till then.